Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, What to Expect in a Security Risk Analysis. So before we begin, a few housekeeping issues. You guys are all on mute throughout the webinar to help prevent background noise. However, if you have any questions or comments, you can always put them in the Q&A section, which is at the top of your screen. At the end of the webinar, we will launch a short poll. It's just 4 simple questions. If you could take about a minute just to answer those, we would greatly appreciate it. It helps us to make these webinars better for you, as well as offering a few tools that you guys may need after the end of the webinar. So getting started, it is that time of year again where everybody in healthcare starts to think about the security risk analysis. We need it for a variety of different ways. One, HIPAA requires us to do a security risk analysis every once in a while. And two, because if you report for MIPS or what used to be the Meaningful Use Program, you have to complete a risk analysis in order to get your MIPS or meaningful use taken care of. It's also just a really great security practice for you to be doing. So one of the biggest reasons why healthcare should be doing security risk analysis as frequently as your organization deems necessary is because the healthcare industry is under attack. All we have to do is open up the news, go online, and we can see every week there's a hospital or a clinic or a payer that has had some sort of security breach. Some of them are results of employee error, and more often than not nowadays, they are cybersecurity issues. So why are we conducting these security risk analyses? One, HIPAA requires you to assess all of your threats and vulnerabilities. So doing that requires you to conduct a security risk analysis, or at the very least, a technical and non-technical evaluation. Both of those are requirements of HIPAA. It's also really important for us just to know and understand what the probability and impact of any risk is to our organization. It helps us with our contingency planning as well as our risk mitigation efforts. So to get really technical, this is the formula that we use when we're doing a security risk analysis. This is the mathematical equation for determining risk. So risk equals your threats times your vulnerabilities times your impact times your probability, all of that minus your controls. Now then you can throw in as many variables into those parentheses as you want to assess your risk, but these are the 5 main variables that need to be assessed every time you do a risk analysis. So, but in order to assess those vulnerabilities, to assess those variables, we need to understand what those variables mean. So the first one is a vulnerability. So if you think about a house, a vulnerability is any point of entry that somebody who's not supposed to be inside your house can get into. It's a flaw or a weakness in your security design. So it can be a window, a door, a hole in the wall, anything that can actually help somebody to get in. So when we think about this from a technical perspective, they are flaws and weaknesses in your security systems, right? So it can be weak passwords. You can also think about it as terminated employees that haven't been, like their access to your systems haven't been taken away yet. So you can have technical and non-technical vulnerabilities to assess. So the technical vulnerabilities that we look at are holes and flaws, weaknesses in the development of your information systems. So a lot of times developers will actually release patches to help fix these vulnerabilities, but they will only do them so long as those softwares are supported by the developer. So we like to talk about Windows. There's been so many different versions of Microsoft Windows, and believe it or not, some organizations are still utilizing Windows XP, which has been sunset by Microsoft for several years now. If you're using Windows Server 2003, that's also been sunset. And so you should be looking for newer software because those vulnerabilities are no longer being patched. We also look at incorrectly implemented or configured systems and lack of technical safeguards. So these technical safeguards are what are your policies that you have in place to help you address security issues, such as password management or your anti-malware. Non-technical vulnerabilities are your policies and procedures or your guidelines, processes, as well as your employees are non-technical vulnerabilities. So what is a threat? A threat is the potential of a person or a thing to trigger or exploit a specific vulnerability. So again, about the house, the threat is the boogeyman, right? So somebody on the outside that wants to come inside to cause harm, right? So, but there are all different kinds of threats. We have natural, human, and environmental threats. So threats can occur anywhere inside of our system, such as information systems, operating systems, as well as our physical environment. So when we talk about probability, this is very simply the likelihood that a threat could exercise a vulnerability. So that is, how likely is it that the boogeyman is going to come in through an open window? If he really wants in, the probability is pretty high. But if that boogeyman is just the mailman delivering mail, likely not going to happen. So we have to look at it very pragmatically on what the threat is and which vulnerabilities are they trying to, or is the potential there for the threat to get in. And the impact. This is probably the most important thing to your organization, because this is what will happen to my hospital or clinic or my organization if a vulnerability is able to be exercised. So we look at 4 main areas when we are looking at risk impact. The number 1 is availability and of our systems or data, right? So this is if it's a ransomware attack and it affects our entire operating systems, then how will that impact us, right? So through availability. We also think about financial cost. How much is this going to cost us? Not only to get everything back up and running, but also in potential fines for a breach, consulting and people to come in and help us mitigate that breach to make sure it never happens again, as well as potential legal costs. Which brings us to the 3rd area of impact we look at, which is legal repercussions. So what can happen to our organization beyond just the regulatory fines if this breach happens? So legal repercussions are typically very few and far between, but there could be situations where if it is a purposeful or a malignant type of breach where that you could experience legal repercussions because of that. HIPAA actually has it written into the law where if it is a malicious breach, you could face jail time. And then the one that we think about probably the most is our reputational harm, because we have to let patients know when we have a breach, small breach, you have to notify everybody that's been affected. You worry about, will this breach cause my organization reputational harm, which could result in an impact to my financial health, right? So am I going to have a loss of patients? Am I going to have to report this to the media because it's a breach with more than 500 people, and now it'll be difficult for me to attract new patients? So what is the overall reputational harm potential if a certain type of breach affects my organization? And then controls, the last variable of the equation, right? So your controls, very simply, are your policies and procedures, as well as your informal processes that you have in place to help you prevent any type of breach. So I'm sure this is why you all came. How do you conduct the security risk analysis? There are 8 steps that most security experts will tell you that you need to take when conducting a security risk analysis. The first step is scoping the assessment. This is very important because it's kind of the why of it all, right? So why are you conducting the security risk assessment, right? Is it response to a security incident? Is it you have to do it once a year for some regulatory purpose? Is it because you guys have had a change of management and you're needing to assess where your security stands? Why are you doing the security risk analysis? You also need to scope out the locations being assessed. Are you doing a risk analysis on your entire organization, or are you focusing in on just one department or one set of technical assets? So you're only going to be evaluating all of your laptops or all your workstations, or so what is being assessed exactly? And then the technology being assessed. Are you assessing your hardware and your software? Are you not assessing technology at all? Are you only doing a non-technical evaluation? What are you doing? And then is any type of additional evaluation that you may need to conduct in order to fit the scope of the assessment. So, and all along the way, you should be documenting everything so that when you come to the last step of your risk analysis, it's much easier for you to accomplish everything. But you also need to consider when you're scoping this assessment out, where the ePHI created, received, maintained, processed, or transmitted. This is important in the case if you're using third parties, which most of us have EMRs nowadays. So if you're going to include your EMR in the risk analysis, and then remote workforce, do you have anybody who's working for you not in your physical location, or people who have the ability to remove devices from your organization, such as laptops, portable media like external hard drives or USB drives. So all of that needs to be included in your risk analysis. And the second step is just gathering all the information, all right? So the first thing that we need to do is probably surveys and questionnaires. They are the easiest way to start to gather information. You can utilize questionnaires to question your staff or employees on how they understand how you're addressing compliance and security issues. You also can use a survey for a facility walkthrough. It's a nice little checklist to make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be, and you can mark your observations down on that checklist, and it helps you to document everything. So gathering the information, the most effective way is through questionnaires and surveys. This is where the fun starts to begin in step 3, where you get to identify your potential vulnerabilities. So a lot of people forget about their non-technical vulnerabilities when they start to look at identifying their vulnerabilities. It's really, really easy to get your technical vulnerabilities. Most people will utilize a vulnerability scanning tool. There's a plethora of them out there. There's RapidFire, Provinsec, I don't know, a ton of them. So you can do a little bit of digging and find a nice vulnerability scanning tool that works for you that will help you to identify all those technical vulnerabilities. You can also utilize the National Database of Vulnerabilities. It is not a complete software listing, and it is very cumbersome and difficult to use. So if you're looking just to save a few dollars and you're thinking that that's the way to go, it will be incredibly difficult and time consuming. And you may also not end up with being able to evaluate known vulnerabilities to all of your softwares. So when we think about non-technical vulnerabilities, this is where it can get a little bit more tricky. So this is where those in step 2, when we talked about surveying your employees, you really need to take the time and observe how your employees are interacting. Do they remember to lock their computers when they stand up and leave their workstation? Are they leaving PHI in areas where a patient can see it? So you need to take the time and assess all those non-technical areas as well. So identifying realistic threats. So develop a list of or a threat statement of potential threat sources related to your operating environment. So you need realistic and probable human and natural incidents that can have an impact in your organization. So we think about human, technical, and environmental. for threat sources. Now then, it's very important for you to think about realistic and probable threats. There are so many cybersecurity threats out there that it would take you a year just to document if you're going to assess every single potential threat source. So really think about how your organization utilizes this technology, how it's networked and connected, and see if you can't narrow down that list. It's really helpful to use threat models. They help to provide a really complete and accurate picture of all of your threats, and they help you to identify risk management steps after you're finished with your risk analysis, because you know which threats are most probable when you utilize a threat modeling system. There are two really common threat models. There's the STRIDE and the DREAD. I think that most security experts have started to move more towards STRIDE and away from DREAD. It does get kind of technical and mathematical when you start to utilize threat models. However, it is one of the most effective ways to understand the entire picture of your threats. So the next step is assess your security controls. So the government put out this really nice tool called the SRA tool. It's completely free, and now it works on both Macs as well as PCs. It is essentially a security an assessment of your security controls, rather. So it's a really long questionnaire, and unfortunately there's no way to get around asking tons of questions. Even when we go in and do security risk analyses and we get to this step, we're asking around 400 questions in order to really understand how your organization's controls, how strong they are. There are other checklists and questionnaires out there that are free. Most of your malpractice insurance carriers will provide an assessment for your security controls for you. So you can always contact your malpractice insurance company to get a questionnaire to help you with this step. But this is where you really need to sit down, read through your policies, answer the questions, understand, are your policies strong enough? Are you doing things that aren't documented? Are you not doing things that you should be doing? One of the things that we see a lot, particularly in smaller clinics, is the lack of sufficient malware protection. So that would be an assessment there. And then when we look at our larger clients, where we see the most weakness in their controls is training on your specific policies and procedures. So you have to think everything. So the smaller organizations struggle more with technical issues, and the larger organizations tend to struggle more with employee type issues. And all of that comes to play here in assessing your security controls. Okay, assess your risk impact. So after you know everything, right? So you know where your what your potential vulnerabilities are, you know what your probable and realistic threats are, you know what potential impact that can have to your organization, and you know how strong your controls or policies are. Now it's time to assess the risk impact. So off of all of those previous 4 variables, you're going to look at it and see, what's the impact to my organization if all of this happens? And remember, there were those 4 points of impact that we like to assess. Right, so you can do a qualitative, which is a non-mathematical approach, or a quantitative, a mathematical approach assessment of all of your assets to see what that potential impact would be. If you have an applications and data criticality analysis, that will help you a lot during this step. Now then, that application and data criticality analysis is a requirement under the contingency planning standard of HIPAA. You are required to have that. So it's really helpful to pull that out, because it helps you to tell you what all your oh my goodness, tongue-tied, what all of your assets are. So all of your software systems, hardware systems, and what you need to support each one of those. It also helps to define appropriate downtimes for each system and what your workarounds will be. And all of that helps you to assess your impact, because it'll tell you, if this system goes down, what order do I need to bring it back up in? So in other words, how critical is it to my organization? And while it's down, how can I work around that? And what impacts will that have on my organization from an employee standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from an availability standpoint, and so forth. Oh, there they are, the 4 areas of impact: financial, legal, operational, and reputational. So you need to evaluate the impact based off of everything that we've done in the previous steps, just because that helps us to really understand what the real impact is and not what we think that it might be. So, and the fun continues with more math, assessing the risk probability. So once you have all those previous 6 steps done, now you need to understand how likely am I really to experience this threat attacking this vulnerability, right? So you can do it qualitatively, which is high, medium, low type of likelihoods, or you can give it a quantitative number. Most security experts will use a 0 to 100 number, 100 being the highest risk and 0 being the lowest risk for each threat and vulnerability. Again, it's very easy to utilize a threat model when going through this step, because it helps you to identify a more mathematical approach to it, so you're not just giving it your feelings. And then, so this step also helps you to assign priority when you're doing your risk management plan. Because you have to remember, this entire process of doing your security risk analysis it doesn't mean anything if you don't actually take the steps after your risk analysis to implement a risk management plan to help you mitigate or manage your risks. Okay, step 8, document all the findings. So we all know in healthcare, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And the same thing is true when you're doing your security risk analysis. If you didn't document all of your steps and you didn't compile a singular report or multiple reports based on each one of those steps, then it's like it didn't happen. You won't be able to prove to any regulatory body that you've completed your security risk analysis, and you won't be able to take action on any of the findings you discovered if it's not documented. The documentation should be easily understood by all stakeholders that are required to read it. So if you outsource your risk analysis, make sure that it is that they have the capability to write your reports in a way that non-technical people will understand it. This is probably the biggest mistake that we see when people outsource their risk analysis, is that they hire these very large technical firms. They do a fabulous job on the risk analysis. They write a fabulous risk management plan, but then nobody can understand it. You get your report back and you don't know what you're supposed to do to move forward. So this is also true if you're going to use your internal IT team or an internal multidisciplinary team. If your IT person is the one responsible for documenting all of your technical vulnerabilities and threats and so forth, it may not be easily understood by non-technical people. So make sure that it's very, very easy to read. Now then, after the assessment, there is still work to do, mainly creating that risk management plan. So your risk management plan needs to be actionable, right? So you need to be able to identify what your threats are and then what steps do you need in order to mitigate that risk. So your plan should also document reasons if you're accepting a risk. So not all of your risks you may want to or have the ability to mitigate. And that's okay, as long as you have a documented reason as to why. And it can't just be based off of financial cost. You can't say, oh, well, it's going to cost me too much money to mitigate this risk, so I'm not going to. It could be that you need to get creative and say, okay, so like I'm using this really old server and the new server is going to cost me $10,000, so I can't do that. You could find a way to say, okay, well, I'm just going to offload all my PHI into the cloud. My EMR company offers cloud-based hosting. I'm going to move all of that there. I'm going to make sure that none of my employees are storing any PHI on the server. I'm going to talk to them about it. I'm going to train them. And then you've mitigated utilizing that old server without really incurring too much additional cost. There will be some associated costs, but not too much. So you have to think about what your organization can do while still addressing the very real risks. You also need to remember that your risk management plan is an ongoing process, right? It's not just a one and done. It's not a checklist. Well, it is kind of a checklist, but it's not something that you can just set aside and never think about again. This is supposed to serve as a guideline for you to deal with known risk between your risk analyses. Right? So if you do a risk analysis once every 3 years, then your risk management plan is that ongoing process for 3 years. If you do a risk analysis once a year, it's active for that 1 year. But you need to make sure that you're actually taking those steps. So often we see people get their really nice risk management plans, they file it away, and they continue like business as usual. And then we come back in a year or so later and we find the exact same risks as last time. So make sure that you are actively working to mitigate those identified vulnerabilities and threats. Not only is it really good for cybersecurity and required by HIPAA, it's also really important for your patients. So the more you ignore the risks and don't mitigate them, the more at risk your patient's PHI is to that breach. Also, if you have a board, your risk management plan is a board level activity. So it involves multiple departments with cross-functionality. One of the biggest mistakes organizations make is saying that your risk analysis is only IT or only compliance, or maybe they'll let those two departments work together and collaborate together to get that risk analysis done. But other departments and the board should help prepare the organization for the potential impact of a breach or security incident. Not just financial planning for everything, but also doing the work itself, right? So when we're talking about the first step of a risk analysis is scoping out that assessment. Your board should actually help you with that. Help identify which areas you're going to be assessing, where that information is stored, how to access it. All of that scope should be defined out by the board. Involving other departments is also really beneficial when doing your risk analysis, because IT and compliance are going to look at the risk analysis process with blinders on. Involving people from HR will help you to have a better understanding of where your employees stand. Involving people from accounting will also help you. Accountants are really, really good with audits, and a risk analysis is just a fancy technical audit. So involving your accounting departments can also help you. So you can start to see how layering in different departments and having this cross-functionality approach to your risk analysis can provide it, it can be so much deeper and more valuable of a risk analysis. So with that, I'm going to open up the questions as well as that really brief poll. So I finished up 2 minutes early, so if there are any questions, please let me know. So if you are planning on doing a security risk analysis, in the poll that I just opened up, we do have a few tools that we are offering to the viewers of this webinar. We have a site walkthrough checklist that we would be happy to email out. Just make sure that you answer that poll and indicate if you want that. We also have an applications and data criticality analysis template that we are more than happy to share with you as well. If you think of any questions after the webinar ends, please feel free to email me. My email is on the screen. Oop, here is one. Can you tell us what the rule requirements for conducting a risk analysis? I argue with someone at work who says it should be done annually. I disagree. What is the truth? Okay, so the truth is, under HIPAA, you are required to do one security risk analysis. The HIPAA security risk analysis rule requires you to do a single security risk analysis, and that is to be followed up with a robust risk management plan. However, there is this evaluation standard of HIPAA, which requires a periodic technical and non-technical evaluation of your organization. that evaluation standard is best met with a risk analysis. Security experts will tell you that how often you do a security risk analysis is based on the complexity of your organization. Some security experts will say annually is best practice, and that's probably true for most organizations, that it's good to do it every year. But if you're really small, do a security risk analysis once every 2 or 3 years. A risk analysis is expensive, it's complicated, and it takes up a lot of time. So if you don't have to do it every year, I would say as long as you have a strong risk management plan in place, to follow that as long as you can. So I hope that answered your question. The rules require periodic evaluation in a single security risk analysis. But that's that. Okay, so another question is, hi, thanks for this webinar. What do organizations do regarding the risk analysis? Do they gather people in their organization who are not experts, or do they hire a third party? So we see a combination. So a lot of small organizations do try to handle the security risk analysis internally, which it can end up in, if you ever do have a breach, or if you're ever audited or investigated by the OCR, it could result in a little ding on you for that if your risk analysis isn't a comprehensive security risk analysis. We see more and more people hiring third parties to do their security risk analyses. When you do hire a third party, make sure that you vet them well, and that they're going to, they understand that you're in healthcare, so you have at least HIPAA to contend with, and whatever your state regulations are as well. Make sure that they have a fair understanding of those, especially if you are in Texas, California, Minnesota, or New York. Those tend to have some of the stricter state rules regarding patient security. So vet well if you hire a third party. If the risk analysis discovers a possible breach that happened 2 years ago, am I obligated to report it since it happened so long ago? Yes. Yes, you are obligated to report it, even if it happened 2 years ago. We see this frequently where organizations were unaware of a vulnerability until they did a security risk analysis. They discovered that that vulnerability was actually breached, and you are still required to report it. If this is a real situation, I would urge you to email or call us after the webinar so that we can help you walk through what the requirements are for this reporting, because there are very specific things that you'll need to report on depending upon the size of the possible breach. Any other questions? All right. Perfect. Thank you guys so much for spending your lunchtime with me and HIPAA for this webinar. If you think of any further questions, again, please email me. You will all get a link to this recording by the end of the day today, so that you can rewatch this and share it with others throughout your organization. Thank you so much, and y'all have a nice day.